I've driven the route from Knoxville to my grandmother's place in Carroll County, Virginia, so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. That's not an exaggeration. I mean, I know every curve, every grade, every town that the highway passes through or bypasses, every exit where the gas stations cluster, and every stretch where there's nothing but trees and guardrails for 20 miles. I started making that drive with my parents when I was a kid, continued making it on my own after I got my license. And by the time I had a wife and 2 children of my own, it was a route that lived in my muscle memory like a song I'd heard 1,000 times. I didn't need a GPS to make it. I used one anyway because Sarah liked having the estimated arrival time on the screen, and because the kids would sometimes watch the little blue arrow crawling along the map from the back seat, asking how much longer, the eternal question of children in cars. It was a comfort thing, the GPS, a redundancy. I knew the way. I'd always known the way, which is why what happened in October of 2021 doesn't make sense to me, and why it still sits in my chest like a stone I can't cough up no matter how many times I try to tell this story. We left Knoxville late. That was my fault. I'd wanted to get on the road by 8, but work ran long and dinner ran longer, and by the time we had the kids buckled in and the car packed, it was almost 10. Sarah said we should just leave in the morning, and I said no. I'd rather drive at night when the roads were empty. And she gave me the look that meant she disagreed, but wasn't going to fight about it, and reclined her seat and closed her eyes before we'd even hit the interstate. The kids, Emma, who was 7, and Jack, who was 4, were asleep before we cleared the Knoxville city limits. So it was just me and the road and the dashboard glow, and the quiet satisfaction of driving through empty darkness toward a place I knew well. The GPS rerouted at 12:07 a.m. I remember the time because I just checked the clock, calculating how much longer until we'd hit the Virginia line. The screen flickered once and the route changed. The blue line shifting off the interstate and onto a road that branched south, and the pleasant automated voice said, "Take the next exit," in that calm tone that brooks no argument. I almost ignored it. The interstate was clear. I knew where I was. There was no reason to exit. But then I noticed the notification at the top of the screen, road closure ahead, 23-minute detour, and I thought, fine. Construction, probably that stretch near the state line they'd been working on for months. I took the exit. The road it put me on was a 2-lane blacktop with no center line. That was the first thing I noticed, and it should have been the first warning. Even the most rural state roads in this part of the country have a painted center line. This one had nothing. Just cracked asphalt disappearing into darkness between walls of trees so dense and close they formed a corridor, branches reaching overhead until the canopy knitted together and blocked out whatever moon or stars might have been visible. I checked the GPS. It showed me on a road with no name, a thin gray line on the map that wound through a valley between 2 ridges, heading toward a destination marker labeled Hollow Creek. I'd never heard of it. I'd driven through this part of the state dozens of times, and I'd never seen this road or this name, and the absence of recognition produced a discomfort that settled in my stomach like a low-grade nausea. The fog started about 5 minutes in. Not the patchy valley fog I was used to in this part of the country, but a solid wall of white that materialized at the tree line and thickened as I drove deeper into the valley. My headlights hit it and scattered into a diffused glow that illuminated nothing beyond about 30 feet. I slowed to a crawl. The road kept winding, descending, taking me deeper into terrain that felt increasingly closed, increasingly deliberate, as if the valley itself were narrowing around the car like a throat. There were no signs, no mile markers, no mailboxes or driveways or power lines or any of the small markers of human habitation that you find on even the most remote Appalachian roads. Just the trees and the fog and the asphalt unspooling ahead of me in the high beams. I should have turned around. I know that now, and I think I knew it then. But there's a particular kind of inertia that takes over when you're driving at night with your family asleep around you. You don't want to wake them. You don't want to admit you made a wrong turn. You trust the technology, because the alternative is admitting you're lost in the mountains at midnight with no cell service, which I discovered when I tried to call my grandmother to tell her we'd be late. No signal, not a single bar. The GPS was working off cached maps, the little blue arrow moving steadily through a landscape that might as well have been the surface of the moon for all I recognized of it. 20 minutes in, I came around a curve and hit the brakes hard enough to wake Sarah. She sat up blinking and said, "What's wrong?" And I didn't answer because I was staring at what my headlights had found, and I didn't have words for it. The road was blocked, not by a fallen tree or a construction barrier or any of the normal things that block mountain roads by cars. 8 or 9 of them, parked bumper to bumper across both lanes in a line that stretched from one shoulder to the other, a barricade of ordinary vehicles arranged with a precision that was clearly intentional. Sedans, trucks, an old minivan, all of them with their engines off and their headlights dark, and their windows reflecting my high beams back at me in flat silver sheets. They were just sitting there, blocking the road completely. Sarah said, "What is this?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Should we get out?" And I said, "No," immediately, with a sharpness that surprised both of us. Something about the scene was wrong in a way that went beyond the obvious strangeness of finding a wall of empty cars on a nameless road at midnight. The cars looked abandoned but not derelict. No flat tires, no broken glass, no visible damage. They looked like they'd been driven there and parked and left, recently, by people who'd then simply vanished. I put the car in park and sat there with the engine running and the headlights boring into that wall of silent vehicles, and I felt the fear come in, not suddenly but in a slow tide that rose from my stomach to my chest to my throat. That's when I started looking at the tree line, and that's when I saw them. They were standing in the woods on both sides of the road, just beyond the furthest reach of my headlights, in that gray zone where light degrades into suggestion. I saw them the way you see something in peripheral vision, not as distinct figures, but as vertical shapes that didn't match the trees, shapes that were too still and too regular and too plainly human to be anything else. I counted 6 on the left side of the road before I stopped counting because my hands had started shaking. They weren't moving. They weren't approaching. They were just standing there, evenly spaced among the trunks, facing the road, facing us, watching with a patience that felt rehearsed. Sarah saw them too. She made a sound that wasn't a word, a small, involuntary noise that came from somewhere deep in her chest, and she reached back without looking and put her hand on Emma's knee, as if to confirm our daughter was still there. I looked in the rearview mirror. Jack was asleep, his head tilted against the car seat. Emma was awake. She was looking out the window at the tree line with an expression I'd never seen on my child's face before, not fear exactly, but a kind of frozen awareness, the look of a small animal that has just registered the presence of a predator. I put the car in reverse. I didn't think about it, didn't discuss it with Sarah, didn't calculate whether the road behind me was wide enough or clear enough. I just shifted gears and hit the gas, and the car lurched backward, and I drove in reverse with one hand on the wheel, and my eyes bouncing between the rearview mirror and the side mirrors, watching the road unspool behind me, while ahead of me the wall of cars and the figures in the trees shrank in the headlight glow but didn't disappear. They stayed where they were. They didn't follow. They just watched us leave. Those dark shapes in the tree line, patient and motionless, as if they'd known all along that we would either stop and get out or we would run, and they were prepared for both. I reversed for what felt like a mile but was probably a quarter of that before I found a wide spot in the road, a place where the shoulder broadened just enough to execute a clumsy 3-point turn, with the tires slipping on gravel, and Sarah gripping the dashboard, and Emma finally starting to cry in the back seat. I got the car pointed the right direction and I drove. I drove fast, faster than I should have on a narrow, foggy road with no center line, and the fog thinned and the valley widened and the trees fell back, and then I was at the exit ramp, climbing back toward the interstate, and the GPS chimed pleasantly and said, "Returning to route," as if it had merely corrected a minor deviation in an otherwise ordinary journey. We didn't talk about it that night. We drove the remaining 2 hours to my grandmother's house in silence, Sarah staring out the windshield, Emma finally asleep again, Jack never having woken up at all. When we arrived, I carried the kids inside and put them to bed, and my grandmother asked how the drive was, and I said fine, and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at my face in the mirror and tried to understand what had happened. In the days that followed, I searched for Hollow Creek. I searched every map I could find: Google, Apple, USGS, topographic maps, old county atlases from the library. There is no Hollow Creek in that part of the state. There is no road matching the one I drove, no valley, no unnamed 2-lane blacktop winding between ridges to a town that doesn't exist. I checked the GPS history on my phone. The route showed us on the interstate the entire way. No detour, no exit, a clean straight line from Knoxville to Carroll County with no deviation. Whatever road I'd driven that night, wherever I'd been for those 30 minutes, it wasn't anywhere my phone could remember. I still make the drive to my grandmother's. I still take the same highway, the same route I've known since childhood, but I don't use the GPS anymore. I killed the app, deleted it, because I don't trust it not to send me back to that valley, back to that nameless road with its wall of empty cars and its silent figures standing in the trees. Sarah and I have talked about it exactly once. She asked me what I thought those people in the woods were doing, and I said I didn't know, and she said she thought they were waiting. And I asked her what for, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said us. She said she thought they were waiting for us, for anyone, for whoever the road brought them next. And I think she's right. And I think about those empty cars parked across the road, all those vehicles that belong to someone, driven by someone, and I think about where those people are now, and I know the answer is in the trees, standing in the dark, patient and still, added to the number, waiting for the next headlights to come around that bend and stop. The funeral was for my Uncle Ray, my mother's brother, a man who'd worked the coal mines around Bluefield for 32 years and had the lungs to show for it by the end. He died on a Tuesday, and we buried him on a Thursday, and afterward the family gathered at my aunt's house and ate casseroles and told stories about him and drank until the stories got repetitive and the grief settled into something quieter and more permanent. I stayed longer than I should have. I was the last one out the door besides my aunt, who hugged me on the porch and told me to drive safe, and I walked to my truck in the dark and checked my phone and saw it was nearly 1:30 in the morning. I had a 3-hour drive back to Charleston ahead of me. I should have stayed the night. My aunt had offered, but the house felt heavy with my uncle's absence, and I wanted to be moving, wanted the road under me, wanted the particular solitude of driving through empty mountains at night when the world shrinks down to nothing but headlights and asphalt and your own thoughts. Route 52 north out of Bluefield is a road that takes you through some of the emptiest country in West Virginia, which is saying something in a state that's mostly empty country. It winds through valleys and over ridges, following old railroad grades and creek beds, passing through towns that are barely towns anymore, a closed gas station, a church, a handful of houses with blue television light in the windows. At 2 in the morning, there's nobody on it. I drove with the radio off because the stations out there are sparse, and I didn't want the crackle of static between signals. Just the engine and the heater and the sound of tires on pavement and the mountains rising black on either side, their ridgelines visible against a sky that held no stars. It was cold. November cold. The kind that seeps into a vehicle even with the heat running. The kind that makes the air feel thin and sharp and slightly hostile. The temperature gauge on the dash read 31 degrees. I remember that because of what I saw next, and because 31 degrees is too cold for anyone to be outside in what she was wearing. I almost didn't see her. The road curved through a stretch of bottomland where the trees pressed close on both sides, and the shoulder narrowed to a strip of gravel barely wide enough to walk on. And my headlights swept around the bend, and there she was, walking on the right shoulder with her back to me, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. A woman, thin, medium height, wearing a nightgown that reached her calves, pale fabric, white or off-white, the kind of simple cotton garment that my grandmother would have called a shift. No shoes, no coat, no hat or gloves or anything that a person would wear outside on a night when the temperature was below freezing. Just the nightgown and her bare feet on the gravel, and her hair loose and dark against the pale fabric, moving slightly in the draft of my truck as I approached. I slowed down. My first thought was that she was hurt, maybe disoriented, a car accident, a domestic situation, someone who'd fled a house in a panic and was now walking in shock along a dark road in the middle of nowhere. My second thought was a dim, uneasy recognition that something about her movement was wrong, though I couldn't immediately articulate what. She was walking too steadily. That was part of it. Not the uneven stumble of someone injured or the hurried stride of someone afraid, but a metronomic, measured pace that didn't vary, that showed no awareness of the cold or the dark or the truck that was now crawling along beside her, with its window rolling down. I called out to her, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" My voice sounded small and flat against the November air, swallowed by the mountains. She didn't respond, didn't turn her head, didn't flinch at the sound, didn't alter her pace by a fraction of a step. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her arms at her sides, her bare feet hitting the gravel with a soft, regular crunch that I could hear through the open window. I tried again, louder this time. "Ma'am, it's freezing out here. Can I give you a ride somewhere?" Nothing, not a glance, not a twitch. I might as well have been speaking to the trees. I drove ahead of her about 50 yards and pulled over and put the truck in park and got out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and total, and I pulled my jacket tighter and walked back toward her on the shoulder of the road. I positioned myself in her path, not blocking her completely, but standing where she'd have to acknowledge me to get past, and I held my hands up, palms open, the way you do with a frightened animal, trying to communicate that I meant no harm. She kept coming. Same pace, same posture, same fixed forward stare. She was close enough now that my truck's headlights and taillights together lit her clearly, and I could see details I hadn't been able to make out from the cab. Her face was pale, not the pallor of cold, but something deeper, something that looked like it had been pale for a long time. Her expression was blank, not peaceful, not distressed, just absent, as if the muscles that controlled expression had been turned off. Her eyes were open and dark, and they looked through me the way a window looks through the wall it's set in, registering nothing, focused on some point beyond me that existed in a distance I couldn't measure. She walked around me. I shifted to stay in her path, and she adjusted without hesitation, stepping off the gravel and onto the grass and curving around me the way water curves around a rock. And then she was past me and back on the shoulder and moving away. As she passed within arm's reach, I saw her feet. They were black, not dirty black, discolored from the sole halfway up to the ankle, coated in a layer of grime and what looked like dried blood, old blood, the dark brown of wounds that had opened and closed and opened again over miles of walking on rough ground. The soles were torn. I could see that even in the dim light, torn and raw, and she was walking on them without any indication of pain, without a limp or a wince, as if the feet belonged to someone else and she was just borrowing them for the journey. And her lips were moving. I noticed it as she passed me, a faint, continuous motion, her mouth shaping words too small and too quiet to hear. Not mouthing silently but whispering, actually producing sound, a thread of voice so thin and low that the wind erased it before it reached my ears. I leaned closer as she went by, close enough to smell her cold air and something else, something damp and organic, like wet earth or old leaves, and I still couldn't make out the words. Just the rhythm of them, steady and repetitive, the same phrase or sentence cycling over and over in a whisper meant for no one, or for someone I couldn't see. I got back in the truck and followed her. I don't know why. I should have called someone, should have driven to the nearest house with a light on and pounded on the door, but I couldn't leave her out there. The temperature was below freezing, and she was barefoot in a nightgown, and something was clearly, deeply wrong, and the part of me that my mother had raised to help people wouldn't let me drive away. So I crept along behind her at walking speed, my hazard lights on, calling out the window every few minutes in a voice that sounded increasingly desperate even to me. She didn't respond, not once. Not a flicker of acknowledgement that I or my truck, or the road or the cold or the night existed. She just walked. After about a mile, she left the road. No hesitation, no transition. She simply turned 90 degrees to the right and walked off the shoulder and into the woods. Not onto a path or a driveway, but into the trees themselves, into underbrush and darkness, moving at the same steady pace through terrain that should have been impassable in bare feet at night. I stopped the truck and got out and stood at the tree line and watched her pale shape recede into the forest, the nightgown catching what little light filtered through the canopy, growing dimmer and smaller until the woods absorbed her completely, and there was nothing left but darkness and the sound of my own breathing and the vast indifferent silence of the mountains. I stood there for a long time, I don't know how long, long enough that the cold had worked its way through my jacket and into my bones, and my fingers were numb and my legs were stiff. I stood there because I couldn't make sense of what I'd just witnessed, and because some part of me kept expecting her to come back out, to emerge from the trees and resume her walk along the shoulder, as if the detour into the forest had been a momentary confusion. She didn't come back. The woods were still and dark and silent. I drove the rest of the way to Charleston with the heater on full and both hands on the wheel, and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of grief, not for my uncle, whose grief was its own separate weight, but for the woman on the road, whoever she was, wherever she was going, whatever had put her out there alone and barefoot and whispering on a frozen November night. I called the Mercer County Sheriff's Office the next morning. I described what I'd seen, gave them the approximate location, the time, every detail I could remember. The dispatcher listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause that lasted several seconds. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how much to tell you. Then she asked me exactly where on Route 52 I'd seen the woman. I told her the stretch between Bramwell and Bluewell, near the old rail crossing. She was quiet again. Then she said, in a voice that was careful and practiced and not at all surprised, that they received that report 3 or 4 times a year. Same stretch of road, same description, a woman in a pale nightgown, walking barefoot, unresponsive. They've sent deputies out every time. They've driven that section of 52 with spotlights. They've searched the tree line, where callers say she entered the woods. They've never found anyone. No footprints in the gravel, no tracks in the underbrush, no sign that any living person walked that road. I asked her how long this had been going on. She said the earliest report she could find in their records was from 1987, but she talked to a retired deputy who remembered calls about it going back to the 70s. Always November. Always between 1 and 3 in the morning. Always the same woman, or the same description of a woman, walking north on Route 52, inches a nightgown with bare feet and a whisper on her lips and eyes that see something the rest of us can't. I asked if they knew who she was. The dispatcher was quiet for a long time, and then she said no. She said they'd looked into it over the years. Checked missing persons reports, cold cases, accidental deaths along that stretch of highway. There were a few possibilities. There are always possibilities in a place where the mountains keep secrets, the way other places keep records, but nothing definitive. Nothing that explained what people kept seeing on that road year after year, decade after decade. I still drive Route 52 sometimes. I take it when I visit my aunt, who still lives in the house where we gathered after my uncle's funeral. I take it during the day now, always during the day. I pass that stretch near the rail crossing and I look at the shoulder where I saw her and the tree line where she disappeared and the road ahead where her eyes were fixed, and I think about what she was walking toward, not away from. I've thought about this a lot, and I'm certain she wasn't fleeing anything. Her pace was too steady, too purposeful. She was going somewhere. She had a destination that only she could see, a place that existed on no map I'll ever hold, and she'd been walking toward it for decades and she hadn't reached it yet. Or maybe she had. Maybe she reaches it every time, and every November she starts again, retracing a journey that loops through the cold, dark mountains like a record skipping in its groove, walking the same road, whispering the same words, passing through the living world without seeing it, because wherever she is, it isn't here. It hasn't been here for a very long time. And whatever she's whispering, whatever message she's carrying down that frozen road to a destination that doesn't exist on this side of the dark, I think it's meant for someone who's been waiting a long time to hear it. I just hope, for her sake, that she finds them. And I hope, for mine, that I never hear what she's saying. I drove trucks with a man named Dale Purcell for the better part of 4 years, running long-haul routes through the Mid-Atlantic and Upper South for a freight company out of Huntington. Dale was 10 years older than me, a quiet guy from somewhere outside Pikeville who'd been driving since he was 21 and who had the kind of calm, unshakable presence you want next to you on a 14-hour run through the mountains at night. Nothing rattled Dale. He'd driven through ice storms and whiteouts and blown tires at 70 miles an hour, and the most animated I'd ever seen him was a slight tightening of his jaw while he worked the problem. He was the steadiest man I ever knew, and I'm telling you that because I need you to understand that when I say something scared Dale Purcell, I mean something genuinely and profoundly wrong happened because Dale didn't scare. Not before that night, and not after it, as far as I know. Just that once. We were running a load of auto parts from Louisville to Ashland on a deadline that didn't leave room for sleep. The customer needed delivery by 7 a.m., and we'd gotten a late start out of the warehouse, which meant we were pushing through the night on Route 23, that long north-south corridor that cuts through the coal country of eastern Kentucky between Pikeville and the Ohio River. It's a road Dale and I had driven dozens of times. We knew every way station, every fuel stop, every diner that kept its lights on past midnight for the truckers running overnight loads. We knew the landscape, the narrow valleys, the hollows that branched off into darkness on either side, the ridgelines that rose black against whatever sky the clouds left you. It was a familiar road, a road we'd memorized, which is why neither of us could explain the truck stop. It was around 3 in the morning. I was driving. Dale was in the passenger seat, half dozing with his boots off and his cap pulled low. We were somewhere south of Paintsville, running along a stretch of 23 that I knew to be empty, no services for maybe 20 miles in either direction. just highway and trees, and the occasional access road disappearing into a hollow. The fuel gauge was getting low, not critical, but low enough that I was planning ahead, calculating whether we had enough to make it to the pilot station near Louisa. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared around a bend, a sudden wash of fluorescent brightness that lit up the tree line on both sides of the highway like a stadium. A truck stop, a big one, set back from the road on a wide apron of concrete, with fuel islands and a parking area, and a flat-roof building attached that had the unmistakable look of a roadside diner, plate glass windows, a lit sign that I couldn't quite read at distance, warm light spilling onto the pavement. There were rigs in the lot, maybe 15 of them, parked in neat diagonal rows, their running lights glowing. The whole place had the look of a well-established operation, the kind of independently owned truck stop that used to dot these highways before the chains took over, the kind of place that had regulars and a reputation and a waitress who knew your name. I said to Dale, "Hey, when did this go in?" He sat up and looked, and didn't answer for a moment, and then said he didn't know. He'd been driving this route for 15 years, and he'd never seen a truck stop here. We looked at each other, and the calculation was simple. We needed diesel, and here was diesel, and whatever confusion we had about the place's existence could be sorted out later. I pulled in. The pumps were the old style, the tall, narrow kind with analog dials that clicked over as the fuel flowed. They worked fine. The diesel went into the tank, and the numbers rolled, and when it clicked off, I went inside to pay. The diner occupied the front half of the building, separated from a small convenience store area by a half wall. It was brightly lit, warm, with a long formica counter and a row of red vinyl booths along the windows and a kitchen visible through a pass-through behind the counter. There were people inside, maybe a dozen, seated at the counter and in the booths, dressed in the usual assortment of trucker attire: flannel, denim, ball caps with equipment logos. A waitress stood behind the counter with a coffee pot. A cook moved behind the pass-through. The jukebox in the corner was playing something country, something I almost recognized but couldn't quite place, like a song I'd heard in a dream. Dale came in behind me, and we sat at the counter, and the waitress came over and smiled and said, "What'll it be, boys?" And her voice was friendly, and her face was pleasant, and there was nothing wrong with her. There was nothing wrong with any of it. That's what made it so hard to understand the feeling that had settled over me the moment I'd walked through the door. A feeling of displacement, of being in a place that looked right and sounded right but wasn't right. The way a room in a dream can be an exact replica of a room you know and still feel fundamentally false. We ordered coffee. She poured it from the pot and it steamed in the cups, and I wrapped my hands around the mug and brought it to my lips and drank and tasted nothing. Not bitterness, not warmth, not the acidic edge of diner coffee that's been sitting on a burner too long. Nothing. The liquid was hot, I could feel the temperature, but it carried no flavor at all, as if someone had heated water and poured it into a coffee mug and expected me not to notice the difference. I set the cup down and looked at Dale, and he was holding his cup in front of his face with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a kind of focused bewilderment, the look of a man who's encountered a problem his experience hasn't prepared him for. He looked at me, and I knew he'd tasted the same nothing. I started paying attention to the other customers. The two men at the booth nearest us were having a conversation. I could hear the murmur of their voices, see their mouths moving, see their hands gesturing, but I couldn't make out a single word. Not because they were quiet, but because the sounds they were making didn't resolve into language. It was like listening to a television in another room, all rhythm and cadence and no content. I strained to hear and caught nothing, not a syllable, just the shape of conversation without the substance. The man nearest the window lifted his fork to his mouth and chewed. I looked at his plate. It was empty. Not scraped clean, not finished, empty, as if no food had ever been on it. He was bringing an empty fork to his mouth and chewing nothing, and setting the fork back down and cutting another piece of nothing with his knife and lifting it again. And across from him, his companion was doing the same thing, both of them performing the ritual of eating with no food on any surface in front of them. I looked down the counter. A man 2 stools over was drinking from a cup that I could see, from my angle, was empty. A woman in the booth behind Dale was buttering a piece of toast that wasn't there, her knife moving smoothly across her empty palm. Everyone in the diner was going through the motions of a meal, lifting, chewing, sipping, cutting, but there was no food. Not on any plate, not on any table, not in the kitchen where the cook stood at the grill, moving a spatula across a surface that held nothing. The entire diner was performing a pantomime so committed and so synchronized that it had almost fooled me, had almost passed for normal in the way that familiar patterns can override the evidence of your own eyes if you let them. Dale put a hand on my arm. He'd seen it too. His face had gone the color of old paper, and his jaw was tight in that way. I recognized the way it got when something was very wrong and he was working the problem. Except this time there was no problem to work, no mechanical failure or road hazard that could be addressed with skill and calm. This was something else. This was a diner full of people who weren't eating, a coffee pot that poured nothing, a place that shouldn't exist doing a performance of normalcy, so thorough and so hollow that being inside it felt like standing on a floor you've suddenly realized has no foundation beneath it. I put money on the counter. I don't know why, habit maybe, or the irrational sense that leaving without paying would draw attention, would break whatever unspoken agreement was keeping the diner's occupants in their seats and their empty forks in motion. I put a 20 next to my untouched cup, and Dale did the same, and we stood up and walked to the door, and the waitress called out behind us, "Have a good night, boys," in that same friendly voice, and I didn't look back because I didn't want to see her face and find it as empty as the plates. We drove for an hour without speaking. The truck stop fell away behind us, and the highway was dark again, and the mountains closed in on either side, and I drove with my hands tight on the wheel, and Dale sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. Finally, somewhere past Paintsville, Dale said, "I want to talk about what just happened," and then he didn't say anything else for a long time, and I didn't either, because we both understood that talking about it would mean admitting it was real, and admitting it was real would mean accepting that something we couldn't explain had happened on a road we knew, as well as our own names. We made the delivery in Ashland by 7. We drove back to Huntington. We went home. We didn't discuss it. 2 weeks later, we ran the same route, same load, same deadline, same stretch of 23 through the Kentucky mountains in the dark. I was watching for it this time. I knew the approximate mile marker, the curve in the road, the section of highway where the truck stop had appeared. We came around the bend, and there was nothing, just trees, hillside falling away to the right, ridge rising to the left, the road cutting through empty forest the way it always had. I slowed down, and Dale leaned forward, and we both stared at the spot where a fully lit, fully operational truck stop with 15 rigs and a diner and a waitress with a coffee pot had stood 2 weeks earlier, and what we saw was undisturbed woodland. No concrete pad, no cleared ground, no tire marks on a shoulder, no gravel, no foundation, no evidence that anything man-made had ever occupied that space. The trees were old growth, uncut, their trunks thick with decades of growth. Whatever had been there, whatever we'd pulled into and sat inside and put money down on the counter of it, wasn't a building that had been demolished in 2 weeks. It was a place that had never existed. Dale quit trucking about 6 months later. He said it was his back, said the long hauls were getting to him, and I'm sure that was partly true. But I think what got to him was the same thing that gets to me when I drive that stretch of 23 at night and watch the tree line for lights that shouldn't be there. It's not the fear of seeing the truck stop again. It's the possibility that we'll stop again, that we'll pull in and sit down and order coffee, and this time the food will be real, and the coffee will have flavor, and the people in the booths will be having actual conversations, and we'll relax, and we'll stay, and the next truckers who pull in at 3 in the morning will find us sitting at the counter with empty cups, lifting invisible forks, chewing nothing, performing the same ritual we watched that night, too far in to remember that we were ever anywhere else. I drive I-40 through the North Carolina mountains at least twice a month for work. I'm a medical equipment technician, and my territory covers a string of hospitals and clinics scattered across the western part of the state, which means I spend a lot of time on that stretch of interstate between Asheville and Marion and Old Fort, the part that drops off the Eastern Continental Divide in a series of sweeping curves and long grades that truckers curse and tourists photograph. It's beautiful country during the day, the Blue Ridge layered out in every direction, the Shenandoah Valley opening up below, the light doing things in the morning fog that make you understand why people paint landscapes. At night it's different. At night it's just dark highway and headlights, and the mountains closing in on either side like walls. And you feel the elevation in your ears, and in the way the engine works harder, and in a subtle atmospheric pressure that might be physical or might be psychological, but either way, makes you aware that you're moving through old, high, remote country that doesn't much care whether you're there or not. The night I'm talking about was in January of 2022. I'd finished a service call at a hospital in Morganton that had run late. Equipment problems always run late. That's the nature of the work. And I was heading west on 40 back toward Asheville, where I had a hotel room and a 6 a.m. alarm. It was past midnight, maybe 12:30, and the interstate was nearly empty. A truck or two, a few scattered cars. Otherwise just me and the road and the mountains and a temperature that the dash said was 26 degrees. There'd been a hard frost that evening, and the guardrails were glittering with it, and the pavement had that slightly wet look that means ice is thinking about forming. I was in the right lane doing about 60, climbing the grade east of Old Fort, when I passed under an overpass and saw them. I didn't process what I was seeing for a full second or two, because my brain tried to file it under normal before the details caught up. Figures on the overpass, small figures. Standing at the railing in a line, evenly spaced, looking down at the highway. Children. 5 of them, maybe 6. The overpass was behind me by the time I started counting, and I was working from a snapshot in my memory, a half-second image lit by the upward spill of my headlights as I passed beneath. They were small, the size of 7 or 8-year-olds, and they were standing perfectly still, arms at their sides, faces angled downward to watch the cars below. No movement, no fidgeting, no turning to each other, none of the restless kinetic energy that children carry in their bodies like a current. They were as still as fence posts. I was a quarter-mile past before the wrongness fully registered. Children on an overpass, after midnight, in freezing weather, with no adults, no vehicle, no visible reason for them to be there. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped and sat with my hands on the wheel and my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the overpass was too far back and too dark to see anything from this distance. I thought about my own kids. I have 2, 9 and 11, and what it would mean for them to be standing on a bridge over a highway in the middle of a January night, and the thought produced a visceral parental dread that overrode every instinct telling me to just keep driving. I called 911. The dispatcher picked up on the second ring, and I described what I'd seen: children on the overpass, no adults, the approximate location. She took the information with professional calm and said she'd send a deputy. I thanked her and sat in my car on the shoulder and looked at the dark strip of mirror that showed me nothing, and felt the particular helplessness of having reported a problem and not knowing if it was being addressed. After about 10 minutes, the helplessness became intolerable. I couldn't sit there. If those were real children standing in the cold on a bridge over a 65-mile-per-hour highway, 10 minutes was too long. Something could happen. Someone could climb over that railing. I put the car in gear and took the next exit. The exit put me on a 2-lane road that ran parallel to the interstate for a mile before crossing over it on the same overpass I'd driven under. I drove slowly, my high beams on, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of children walking, hiding, standing in the brush. Nothing. The road was empty. The shoulders were empty. The tree line on either side was dark and still. I reached the overpass and slowed to a crawl and looked. It was empty. The overpass stretched across the interstate below, a simple concrete span with metal railings on both sides, and there was nobody on it. No children, no adults, no one. I stopped the car in the middle of the overpass and got out and stood in the freezing air and looked at the concrete surface and the railings and the highway below, where my own car's flashers were still blinking on the distant shoulder. The concrete was coated in a thin layer of frost, smooth and undisturbed and perfectly even, no footprints. I walked the length of the overpass and back, checking both railings, checking the ground on either side where the concrete met the road. The frost was unbroken everywhere. If 5 or 6 children had been standing here 10 minutes ago, there would have been marks, footprints, scuff marks, patches where body heat had melted the frost. There was nothing. The overpass looked like no one had walked on it in hours. I stood there in the cold for a while, trying to reconcile what my eyes had shown me minutes ago with what they were showing me now. I'd seen them. I was certain of that. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, not the kind of highway hypnosis that makes you see things on long drives. I'd seen children standing at a railing looking down at me, distinct enough that I could estimate their height and their number and the spacing between them. And now they were gone, with no trace, no evidence, no physical indication that they'd ever been there. The deputy arrived about 15 minutes later, a young guy in a Buncombe County cruiser who pulled up behind my car on the overpass with his lights going and got out and listened to my account with a patience that I appreciated and an expression that I couldn't quite read. He walked the overpass himself, checked the railings, shone his flashlight into the tree line on both sides. He found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of anyone. He walked back to me and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath making clouds in the cold air, and he told me something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He said I was the third person that month to call 911 about children on that overpass. Same description every time. 5 or 6 kids, small, standing in a line at the railing, looking down at the highway. Always after midnight, always in winter. The deputies always responded and never found anyone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. He said the calls had been coming in for at least 2 years. Maybe longer. He'd been on the force for 3 years, and it had been happening for his entire tenure. Other deputies had told him about similar reports going back further, though he couldn't confirm how far. He said it matter-of-factly, without inflection, the way someone relates a thing they've accepted as part of their reality, even though it defies explanation. He said be safe out there, and got back in his cruiser and left. I drove to my hotel in Asheville and sat on the bed and didn't sleep. I kept seeing them in that half-second snapshot, the small figures, the even spacing, the absolute stillness. I kept thinking about the frost on the overpass, unbroken, unmarked, as if the concrete hadn't been touched by anything warmer than the January air. And I kept coming back to the deputy's words. Third person that month. The calls keep coming. They never find anyone. In the weeks that followed, I asked around. I asked colleagues who drove that stretch of interstate regularly, asked hotel clerks in the area, asked a nurse at the Morganton Hospital who lived in Old Fort and commuted on 40 every day. Most people looked at me blankly. A few shifted their weight and changed the subject in ways that told me they'd heard something but didn't want to discuss it. One man, an older technician at the Marion Clinic, listened to my story and then was quiet for a long time and said his daughter had seen the same thing. 3 years earlier, driving home from a concert in Asheville, she'd passed under that overpass and seen children standing on it. She'd called the police. They'd found nothing. He said she wouldn't drive that section of 40 at night anymore. He said it like a fact, without emotion, the way you say the sky is blue. I still drive that road. I have to. It's my territory, my livelihood. I drive it at night when the schedule demands it, and I approach that overpass with a tightness in my chest that doesn't ease until I'm past it. Most nights it's empty. Just concrete and railing and frost and the ordinary darkness of a mountain highway. But I've seen them one more time, last November, passing under at close to 1 in the morning. The same line of small figures at the railing, the same impossible stillness, the same downward gaze fixed on the highway below. I didn't stop. I didn't call 911. I just drove, hands tight on the wheel, eyes forward, and let the overpass fall away behind me into the dark. I don't know who they are. I don't know what they're doing up there, or where they go when someone climbs up to look, or why they leave no trace on the frost. I've searched for accidents at that location, for tragedies involving children in that area, for anything that might anchor the sightings to a history I could understand. I've found nothing conclusive. There are stories, of course there are always stories in these mountains, layers of them going back centuries, but none that fit neatly enough to explain 5 or 6 children standing in a line on a bridge in the freezing dark, watching the cars pass below with a patience that doesn't belong to the living. What I keep coming back to, what sits with me on those late-night drives when the mountains are close and the highway is empty and the overpasses loom ahead like dark frames around darker openings, is the way they were looking down. Not at the road, not at the traffic, at something specific, as if each car that passed beneath them was being observed, evaluated, measured against some criteria I can't imagine. As if they were waiting for a particular set of headlights, a particular vehicle, a particular driver who hadn't come yet but would, eventually, because they were patient and the road was long and the nights kept coming, one after another, cold and dark and full of travelers who didn't know they were being watched. I started driving trucks when I was 23 years old because I needed money, and I didn't mind being alone, and I'd grown up in these mountains and knew the roads the way some people know the hallways of their own house. My father drove trucks before me, short-haul runs mostly, regional stuff through the Appalachian states, Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, Kentucky. He taught me to drive on back roads in Fannin County before I was old enough for a permit, and he taught me the CB the same way, showed me the channels and the etiquette and the unwritten rules that truckers followed like scripture. Channel 19 for general traffic. Channel 9 for emergencies. Keep your transmissions short. Listen more than you talk. The CB was the nervous system of the highway in those days. Less so now with cell phones and GPS, but in 2017 it was still alive on the mountain routes, still carrying the voices of drivers who preferred the old way of doing things, who liked the company of strangers' voices in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, when the roads were empty and the mountains pressed close. I heard a lot of strange things on the CB over 11 years. Drivers talking to people who weren't there, transmissions in languages that didn't belong to any trucker on any American highway, bursts of music from stations that didn't exist, old country songs or gospel hymns that would play for 30 seconds and cut to static. The mountains do things to radio signals. They bounce them, bend them, trap them in valleys where they echo and distort until a human voice sounds like something dragged up from a well. You learn to ignore most of it. You learn that the airwaves in Appalachia are unreliable narrators, and that not everything you hear through that speaker has a living person on the other end. I'd accepted this, the way I'd accepted bad weather and rough roads, as a condition of the work, part of the landscape. But what I heard on the night of February 9th, 2017, was different from anything that came before or after, and it's the reason I don't drive trucks anymore. I was running a load of building materials from Atlanta to a supply depot in Murphy, a route that took me up 515 through the mountains of northern Georgia. It's a beautiful road in daylight. The highway follows the old railroad grade through the Chattahoochee National Forest, climbing through hardwood hollows and crossing rivers that run cold and clear even in summer. At 1 in the morning in February, it was something else. The trees were bare and black against a sky with no moon, and the mountains on either side of the highway were dark masses that you felt more than saw, presences that narrowed the world to a corridor of asphalt and headlights. I was north of Blue Ridge, past the lake, on a stretch of highway where the forest closed in tight, and there were no exits and no houses and no lights except mine. The CB had been quiet for 20 minutes, just the low hiss of an open channel, when the voice came through. It was a man, speaking slowly, deliberately, with a clarity that cut through the usual static like a knife through cloth. His voice was calm and flat, without inflection or emotion, and he was giving directions. Turn left at the dead oak. Follow the creek bed north for a quarter mile. The stone wall marks the entrance. Pass through the gap where the wall has fallen. The house sits in the clearing beyond the second ridge. He spoke these words with the measured precision of someone reading from a script, pausing between each instruction as if to let the listener absorb it, and then he started over from the beginning. Turn left at the dead oak. The same words, the same cadence, the same flat voice. A loop. He was broadcasting the same set of directions on repeat, with no introduction, no sign-off, no identification, just the directions themselves, cycling endlessly like a recording. I keyed the mic. This is southbound 515 north of Blue Ridge. Who's transmitting on 19? No response. The voice continued without pause or acknowledgement, as if my transmission had never happened. Turn left at the dead oak. Follow the creek bed north. I tried again, twice more, and got nothing. He wasn't listening. He wasn't having a conversation. He was broadcasting, pushing these directions out into the dark air of the Georgia mountains with the single-minded persistence of a signal beacon. Other drivers started chiming in. A northbound rig somewhere near Ellijay asked the same question I had, who's on 19, and got the same nothing. A flatbed driver outside Blue Ridge said he'd been hearing it for the past half hour and couldn't figure out the source. A livestock hauler near Blairsville said the signal was strong on his end too, stronger than local traffic usually was, as if the transmitter was close to all of us simultaneously, which wasn't possible given that we were spread across 40 miles of highway. We talked over each other and around the voice, trying to triangulate, trying to make sense of it, and all the while the directions continued beneath our chatter like a current beneath a river, steady and calm and completely indifferent to our confusion. It went on for about an hour before someone said something that changed the temperature of the conversation entirely. A driver whose handle I didn't catch, an older man by the sound of his voice, came on the channel and said, real quiet, that he knew those directions. He said he'd grown up in Fannin County, same as me, and he recognized the landmarks. The dead oak was a tree that had stood at a trailhead off a Forest Service road east of Springer Mountain, a tree that had been struck by lightning sometime in the 60s and left standing as a dead landmark that the locals used for navigation. The creek bed was UNTOLD Creek, which ran north through a hollow before turning east toward the Toccoa River. And the stone wall. He paused here, and in the pause I heard something I recognized from my own voice on the nights when the mountains felt too close, something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The stone wall was part of an old homestead, a place deep in the Chattahoochee that had been abandoned since the mid-70s. A family had lived there, he said, a man and his wife and the man's brother and 4 children. They'd been subsistence people, off the grid before off the grid was a concept anyone used, living on land that might or might not have been legally theirs, growing what they could and hunting what they couldn't grow. In 1974 or 1975, he wasn't sure of the exact year, someone noticed they hadn't been seen in town for weeks. A sheriff's deputy hiked in and found the homestead intact. Clothes in the drawers, food in the pantry, some of it rotting. Tools hung on their pegs. The fire in the stove had burned down to cold ash, but the family was gone, all 7 of them. No sign of violence, no sign of packing, no sign of anything that would explain why 3 adults and 4 children would walk away from their home and their possessions and their lives and vanish into the Chattahoochee National Forest without a trace. The channel went quiet after he finished talking. Not just our conversation, the voice went quiet too, for the first time in over an hour, and the silence that filled the cab of my truck was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. I drove through it the way you drive through fog, slowly, waiting for it to lift. It didn't lift. After maybe 3 minutes, the voice came back, same as before, same flat tone, same unhurried cadence. Turn left at the dead oak. Follow the creek bed north. And it continued for 3 more hours. I listened to the whole thing. I don't know why. I could have changed channels, could have turned the CB off, could have driven in silence and let the voice talk to an empty cab. But I listened. The way you listen to a sound you can't identify in the woods at night, not because you want to hear it, but because not hearing it feels more dangerous than hearing it. The directions never varied. Not a word changed, not a pause shifted. It was the same loop, the same instructions, delivered with the same mechanical calm, as if the voice had been giving these directions for a very long time and would continue giving them for a very long time after I was gone. It stopped at 4:17 in the morning, mid-sentence. Follow the creek bed and then nothing. A clean break, as if someone had pulled a plug. The static hissed and the channel was empty, and I was alone in my truck on a dark highway in the mountains of Georgia, with the taste of cold coffee in my mouth and a feeling in my chest, like something had been sitting on it for hours and had just stood up. I made my delivery in Murphy and drove back to my apartment in Canton, and didn't sleep well for 3 nights. During the day I asked around. I stopped at truck stops along my regular routes and brought it up casually. The way you bring up things you're not sure you want, confirmed. Most drivers shrugged. A few gave me odd looks. But 2 of them, one at a pilot station near Chatsworth and another at a little independent stop outside Dahlonega, told me they'd heard the same broadcast. Same directions, same voice, same stretch of 515 inches the mountains north of Blue Ridge. One of them had heard it the previous winter. The other had heard it 3 years before that. Both said it happened at night, between midnight and dawn, always in the cold months. Neither could explain it. Neither had reported it. They told me the way people in these mountains tell you things they can't explain matter-of-factly, without embellishment, with an implicit understanding that the mountains contain things that don't submit to explanation, and that the proper response is acknowledgement, not investigation. I looked into the family. I spent a weekend at the Fannin County Library, going through old newspapers and county records, and I found a brief mention in the Blue Ridge Summit from March of 1975, a small article about an abandoned homestead in the National Forest, a family unaccounted for, an investigation that went nowhere. The article named them, the father, the mother, the uncle, the 4 children. I read those names in the quiet of the library and felt the same heaviness I'd felt in the truck, the same sense of proximity to something vast and sad and unresolved. I quit trucking 6 months later. I told people it was the hours, the wear on my body, the time away from home. That was all true, but the real reason was that I couldn't stop listening. Every night run through the Georgia mountains, I'd turn the CB to channel 19 and wait. And the waiting was worse than the hearing, because it meant I was looking for it. Meant I'd become part of whatever audience those directions were intended for. And I didn't want to be part of that audience. I didn't want to know those directions by heart, which I already did. Turn left at the dead oak, follow the creek bed north. The stone wall marks the entrance. I didn't want to know the way to a house in the Chattahoochee, where 7 people walked out the door one day, and the forest swallowed them whole, and the only thing left was a voice on a frequency that nobody controls, still giving directions to a place that nobody should go, still calling travelers through the dark toward a clearing in the mountains, where something happened that the trees remember even if we don't. Megan liked the back roads. That was one of the first things I learned about her when we started dating. She had no interest in highways, no patience for interstates, no desire to get anywhere quickly when getting there slowly meant winding through country she'd never seen before. She'd grown up in Roanoke and knew the Blue Ridge, the way people who've lived somewhere their whole lives know a place, not from maps but from accumulated experience, from 1,000 Sunday drives and weekend hikes, and aimless wanderings down roads that didn't appear on any GPS. She had a sense for the mountains that I envied. She could look at a ridge and tell you which hollow was on the other side. She could smell rain coming hours before the sky showed it. And she could find roads I'd never heard of, county roads and Forest Service roads, and unnamed gravel tracks that cut through the mountains on routes that predated the automobile by a century or more. I loved that about her. I loved riding in the passenger seat while she drove and pointed out things I'd never have noticed: a chimney standing alone in a field where a house had burned, a cemetery so old the stones had gone smooth, a creek that ran red with iron. The mountains were alive to her in a way they'd never been for me, which is why I trusted her completely when she turned off Route 11 south of Lexington one October afternoon and took us onto a road I'd never seen before, heading east into the Blue Ridge on a 2-lane blacktop that didn't have a sign at its intersection, and climbed steeply through hardwoods that were blazing with fall color. I didn't ask where we were going, because with Megan the going was the point. The road climbed for about 20 minutes, switchbacking up the side of a ridge through forest so dense the canopy formed a tunnel of orange and red above us. It was mid-afternoon, but the light was already going. October days are short in the mountains, and the eastern slopes lose the sun early. Megan was driving, leaning into the curves with the casual confidence of someone who'd taken 1,000 mountain roads, and I was watching the trees and the sky and the light, and feeling the particular contentment that comes from being in beautiful country with someone you love. We came around a long curve near what felt like the top of the ridge, and the road straightened, and there, cut into the rock face ahead of us, was a tunnel. It wasn't remarkable at first glance. These mountains are full of tunnels, old railroad passages, WPA-era road tunnels, mining cuts that got repurposed for vehicle traffic. This one was small, a single lane cut through maybe 100 yards of ridge, with rough stone walls and no lighting. The entrance was a dark mouth in the rock face, arched at the top, with moss and ferns growing around the edges, where moisture seeped from the stone. I remember Megan slowing down as we approached, not because she was concerned, but because she was taking it in, the way she took everything in, with attention and curiosity. She said she didn't remember this tunnel. She said she'd driven most of the county roads in this part of the mountains, and she'd never come through here before. Then she shrugged and we drove in. The headlights flickered the moment we crossed the threshold. Not a full failure, but a stutter, a rapid on-off on that made the tunnel walls strobe and the shadows jump. The radio, which had been playing something quiet, cut to static, not a gradual loss of signal, but an instantaneous switch, as if someone had changed the station to a frequency that carried nothing but white noise, and the temperature dropped. That's the detail that stays with me most vividly, more than the lights or the radio, because it was so immediate and so severe. The air in the car went from comfortable to freezing in the space of a breath. I watched our exhaled air turn to fog in front of our faces, twin plumes of white vapor that clouded the windshield, so suddenly Megan hit the defrost. It was as if we'd driven into a walk-in freezer, as if the rock around us was radiating cold the way a stove radiates heat, pushing it into the car through the vents and the windows and the seams in the doors. We were through in seconds. The tunnel was short, and Megan didn't slow down, and we emerged into the fading October light on the other side of the ridge, and the headlights steadied, and the radio faded back in, and the temperature began to climb back toward normal. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, and looked at Megan, and she was gripping the wheel tighter than usual, but but her face was calm. I looked in the rearview mirror. Something was standing in the tunnel entrance behind us. The opening was maybe 50 yards back and receding, a dark arch in the rock face framed by trees, and at its edge, right at the boundary where the daylight met, the darkness inside, there was a shape. It was tall. That was the first thing I registered, and the thing that hit hardest, because it was too tall, taller than the proportions of a human body should allow, a long vertical darkness that stood at the mouth of the tunnel like a figure standing in a doorway. It wasn't moving. It was just there, occupying the space between light and dark, and even at 50 yards and growing, I could feel it looking at us. Not see it looking, feel it, the way you feel someone's gaze on the back of your neck in a quiet room. Megan said, "Did you see that?" And I said yes, and neither of us said anything else, and she drove faster. 20 minutes of mountain road passed. The ridge fell behind us, and the road descended through a series of hollows that were already in shadow, the trees still bright overhead, but the ground going dark. Megan had both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and I was watching the mirrors the way you watch a door you've just locked, checking, rechecking, waiting for confirmation that whatever had been behind us was gone. The rear view showed empty road. The side mirrors showed trees and pavement and the last copper light of the afternoon. I started to relax. I told myself it had been a shadow, a trick of the light and the tunnel's geometry and the adrenaline that the cold and the flickering headlights had produced. I was constructing a rational explanation, and I was almost finished with it when Megan made a sound. A small, involuntary sound, barely audible, the kind of sound you make when pain or fear bypasses your conscious mind and speaks directly through your throat. She was looking in the side mirror on her door. Her face had lost all its color, and her hands were white on the wheel, and she said, "Don't look." I looked. In the passenger side mirror, close, much closer than anything should have been without me seeing it approach, there was a shape. Dark, narrow, tall, positioned just behind the car and slightly to the right, as if it were standing on the road surface and moving at exactly our speed. It had no features I could make out, no face, no limbs that I could distinguish from the central mass. It was just a darkness, a vertical absence, occupying space in the mirror the way a shadow occupies a wall, except that we were moving at 40 miles an hour on a mountain road, and it was keeping pace without effort, without any visible means of locomotion, as if it were attached to us by an invisible line. Megan accelerated. The speedometer climbed from 40 to 50 to 60, faster than was safe on a road with those curves, and I braced against the door and watched the mirror, and the shape stayed exactly where it was. Same distance, same position, same effortless pursuit. It didn't fall behind. It didn't gain. It maintained its place behind the car, with a precision that felt mechanical, automated, as if our vehicle were towing it on a cable. I looked away and looked back, and it was still there. I rolled down the window and stuck my head out and looked directly behind us and saw nothing, just empty road and trees and gathering dark. But when I pulled my head back in and checked the mirror, there it was. It existed only in the reflection, only in that narrow rectangle of glass, visible to mirrors but invisible to direct sight. We drove for 2 hours. We came down out of the mountains and hit Route 11 and turned south toward Marion. And for every minute of those 2 hours, the shape was in the mirror. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about anything. Megan drove with rigid focus, and I sat in the passenger seat and checked the mirrors compulsively, hoping each time that it would be gone, and each time it wasn't. It was patient. That was the quality that frightened me most, not its size or its darkness, or the impossibility of its presence, but its patience, the sense that it could follow us forever, that distance and speed were meaningless to it, that it would be there for as long as it wanted to be there, and would leave when it decided to leave and not a moment before. We stopped for gas in Marion. I went inside to pay, and when I came out, Megan was standing by the car looking at the mirrors with her arms crossed and something like relief in her face. It was gone. Both mirrors showed empty parking lot, gas pumps, the lights of the station, just the ordinary world, uninhabited by anything that shouldn't be there. We filled the tank and got back on the road and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, because neither of us wanted to drive through the mountains in the dark, and because we were both exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained fear, from hours of hypervigilance, from the effort of processing something your mind wasn't built to contain. I fell asleep fast. Deep, heavy, dreamless sleep, the kind that drops you like a stone. I don't know how long I was under before Megan's scream pulled me out of it. She was sitting upright in bed, rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on the foot of the bed, and the scream that was coming out of her was not a word or a cry, but a raw, involuntary sound that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than her lungs. I grabbed her arm and said, What is it?" And she pointed at the foot of the bed and said it was there. It was standing right there. It was watching us. I hit the lamp on the nightstand. The room flooded with light. There was nothing at the foot of the bed, nothing in the room, just the motel furniture and the drawn curtains and the door with its chain still fastened and the stale air of a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and age. Megan was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. I held her and told her it was a dream, a nightmare, that there was nothing there. And she looked at me with an expression that I recognized because I'd seen it in the car. Not fear exactly, but the thing that comes after fear, the knowledge that something has entered your life that you can't explain and can't undo and will carry with you from this point forward. We drove home the next morning. We never talked about it. Not once. Not in the 5 years since. We're married now, living in a house in Salem, and in every other respect our life is normal and good and unremarkable. But Megan sleeps with the light on. Every night, without exception, the bedside lamp stays on from the time she closes her eyes until morning. She doesn't explain it, and I don't ask. I know why. I know she's making sure that if she wakes in the night and looks toward the foot of the bed, she'll be able to see what's there, or confirm what isn't. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep and I'm lying in that lamplight watching the ceiling, I think about the tunnel and the mirrors and the shape that followed us down the mountain, and I wonder if it ever really left. I wonder if it's still behind us, still keeping pace, still patient, still waiting, visible only in reflections we haven't thought to check. And I wonder what would happen if I got up in the dark and stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked over my shoulder. I wonder what I'd see standing behind me, tall and thin and silent, in the doorway where the light meets the shadow. I don't check. I never check. Some mirrors are better left alone. I'm not a superstitious person. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest of this, because I know how it sounds, and I know what you'll think, and I need you to understand that I'm the last person who would tell you a ghost story and expect you to believe it. I grew up in a house where my father fixed things with his hands and my mother balanced the checkbook to the penny, and nobody talked about anything they couldn't see, touch, or verify with a receipt. I studied engineering for 2 years at Tennessee Tech before I dropped out and went to work for a utility company running cable through the rural counties south of Cookeville. That's practical work, physical work, the kind of work that leaves no room for imagination because the wire either carries current or it doesn't, and the ground is either stable enough to hold a pole or it isn't. I've spent my adult life dealing in things that are measurable and concrete. So when I tell you what happened on Highway 56 inches, November of 2019, I need you to know that I've spent 5 years trying to measure it, trying to make it concrete, and I can't. It doesn't fit inside the framework I built my life around. And that's the part that still keeps me up at night. I was coming back from a job site in Salina, which is about as far north as you can go in Tennessee before you fall into Kentucky. The work had run late. It always ran late in Salina, something about the terrain up there, the limestone and the clay, that made everything take twice as long as it should. By the time I had my tools loaded and the truck pointed south, it was past 10, and I had a 2-hour drive back to Cookeville on roads that were mostly 2-lane and mostly empty after dark. I should have filled up in Salina. There was a station right at the edge of town, and I saw it, and I thought about it, and I did the math in my head. The gauge was just above a quarter tank, and I figured that was enough to get me home if I drove steady. It wasn't. That's the kind of miscalculation that feels stupid in retrospect because it is stupid. The kind of false economy that saves you 2 minutes and costs you a night you'll never forget. The engine started stuttering about 45 minutes in, on a stretch of 56 between Gainsboro and Baxter, where the road runs through hill country so empty that the darkness feels personal, like it's been waiting for you specifically. I nursed the truck for another mile, coasting on the downhills, and then the engine died, and I rolled to a stop on the shoulder and sat there in the sudden silence and said a word my mother wouldn't have approved of. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, no signal. This was Jackson County, where cell coverage was a rumor, and the nearest tower was probably on the other side of a ridge that might as well have been on the other side of the earth. I had no gas, no phone, no passing traffic, and no options except walking. I grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox and started south on the shoulder. It was cold, mid-November cold, the air sharp with the smell of dead leaves and wood smoke from some unseen chimney somewhere in the hills. The road was empty in both directions, a strip of pavement running through darkness, and I walked on the white line with my flashlight pointed ahead and tried not to think about how far it was to the next town. 2 miles, maybe 3. I could see nothing on either side of me but trees, black trunks rising from ditches choked with brush, and above them a sky that was clear enough to show stars, but offered no light that reached the ground. I smelled it before I saw it. Gasoline and motor oil, and the faint metallic tang of old machinery, the particular smell of a working garage that's been soaking those odors into its concrete and walls for years. I came around a gentle curve, and there it was, set back from the road on the right side, lit up like something out of a painting. A gas station. Small, 1-story, with a single pump island out front, 2 pumps mounted on a concrete pad, and a garage bay on the right side with its door rolled down, and an office on the left with a glass front and a light burning inside. The pumps were the old kind, the tall rectangular units with analog dials and metal nozzles, and beside them was a hand-painted price board on a wooden post. I stopped walking and stared at it. The prices on the board were wrong. Not wrong like outdated by a few years, wrong like they belonged to another era entirely. Regular was listed at 63 cents a gallon. The numbers were painted in white on a black background in careful, slightly uneven hand lettering, and they glowed in the light from the office like a message from a world where a dollar still meant something. I should have felt relief. Here was a gas station, here was gasoline, here was the solution to my problem, standing right in front of me with its lights on and its pumps ready. But what I felt was something else, a hesitation, a resistance, as if some part of my brain that operated below conscious thought was looking at this place and finding it inconsistent with reality in ways I couldn't articulate. It was too intact. That was part of it. The building was old, the architecture, the pump style, the hand-painted sign all said 1960s or 1970s, but it wasn't weathered. The paint was bright. The glass was clean. The concrete pad was uncracked. It looked the way it must have looked the day it opened, preserved in a state of newness that 40 or 50 years of Tennessee weather should have long since erased. I walked up to the office door and pushed it open. A bell jingled overhead, the mechanical kind mounted on a spring. Inside was a small room with a counter, a cash register, the old manual kind with push buttons, and a drawer, a rack of road maps, and a few shelves of automotive supplies. Motor oil, fan belts, wiper blades, all in packaging I didn't recognize, brands that had names like they belonged to a different decade. The room was warm and well lit and completely empty. No one behind the counter, no one in the garage bay, no one anywhere that I could see. I called out hello, and my voice came back to me from the hard surfaces, and nobody answered. I went back outside and tried the pump. I lifted the nozzle and squeezed the handle, and gasoline flowed. Real gasoline. I could smell it and see it, and it splashed into a gas can I found sitting beside the garage bay, as if it had been left there for me. I filled the can, maybe 2 gallons, enough to get me to a real station, and hung the nozzle back on the pump, and went inside and put a $20 bill on the counter next to the register. I looked around one more time. The office was silent. Through the window I could see the pump island and the road beyond it, and the darkness of the hills, and everything was still and quiet and wrong in a way I couldn't name. I left. I walked back to my truck with the gas can in one hand and the flashlight in the other, and I didn't look back because looking back felt like something I shouldn't do, though I couldn't have told you why. The gas went into the tank, and the engine turned over on the first try, and I pulled back onto 56 heading south, and within 2 minutes I was approaching the spot where the station had been. I knew the curve, knew the approximate distance. I slowed down and looked to the right and saw nothing. Not a closed station, not a dark station, not a building with its lights off. Nothing. A concrete pad, cracked and buckled and colonized by weeds that had pushed through every seam. A rusted metal housing that might have been a pump base, stripped of everything useful, standing in the weeds like a headstone. No building, no office, no garage, just a pad and a ruin, and 40 years of neglect visible in every surface. I stopped the truck and sat there with the engine idling and the headlights illuminating a place that bore no resemblance to what I'd walked through 10 minutes earlier. The concrete pad was there, in the right location, the right size, but it looked like it hadn't been used since the Carter administration. The pump housing was rusted through in places. Small trees were growing through cracks in the concrete. This wasn't a station that had recently closed. This was a station that had been dead for decades. I drove home. I drove with the gas that I'd pumped from a place that didn't exist anymore, and the engine ran fine on it, and when I got home, I checked my wallet and the 20 I'd left on the counter was gone. Real gas, real money, real transaction, unreal place. I went back a week later in daylight. I brought a camera, and I walked the concrete pad, and I photographed everything. The rusted pump base, the cracked foundation, the weeds. There was no building, no roof, no walls, no glass. Just the pad and some debris that might have been foundation blocks, and a stillness that felt heavy and specific, the kind of quiet that accumulates in places where something ended badly. I found, half buried in the brush behind where the building would have stood, a piece of signboard black paint on plywood, rotted soft, with a fragment of a white number still visible, a 6, or maybe an 8. I couldn't tell. It took me 3 months to find the article. I searched online databases and newspaper archives, and finally found it in a scanned collection of the Jackson County Sentinel from April of 1978. A gas station owner named Harold Embry, age 57, had been shot and killed during a robbery at his station on Highway 56 between Gainsborough and Baxter. The robbers took approximately $40 from the register and were never caught. The station closed following his death and was never reopened. The article included a photograph. Harold Embry standing beside his pump island, a lean man in work clothes with a serious face and his hands in his pockets, and behind him, clearly visible, was the price board. Hand-painted white numbers on a black background. Regular 63 cents, the same board, the same prices. The same station, alive in a photograph from 1978, dead on a roadside in 2019, and somehow alive again for the 10 minutes I'd spent there in the dark with a gas can and a $20 bill. I think about Harold Embry. I think about him more than I'd like to. I think about a man who spent his life running a gas station on a back road in rural Tennessee, who kept his pumps working and his lights on and his prices painted neatly on a board, who was killed for $40 by someone who was never held accountable, and whose station died with him and crumbled into weeds and rust. And I think about the $20 I left on his counter, sitting there next to a register that doesn't exist in a building that isn't there, and I wonder if he found it. I wonder if somewhere, in whatever fold of time or memory that place occupies on the nights when it decides to exist again, Harold Embry walked into his office and saw the bill on the counter and put it in the drawer and felt, for just a moment, like the world was still working the way it was supposed to. I hope so. I hope the gas I took and the money I left closed some small loop that needed closing. I hope I did right by a dead man who kept his lights on for me on a cold night when I had nowhere else to go. And I hope I never find myself on that stretch of 56 after midnight again, because I don't know if the station would appear, and I don't know what it would mean if it did, and there are some debts between the living and the dead that are better left settled. We'd been on the road for 11 hours, and Rachel was done. I could see it in the way she was holding herself in the passenger seat, not just tired but depleted. That particular state of highway exhaustion where the body starts making decisions the mind hasn't approved, the eyelids getting heavy between blinks, the head dipping forward and jerking back up. We'd left our place in Charleston, South Carolina, that morning heading for her parents' house outside Johnson City, Tennessee, a drive that should have taken 6 hours, but had been stretched to nearly double by an accident on I-26, somewhere in the upstate, that had turned the highway into a parking lot for 3 hours. By the time we cleared the jam and crossed into North Carolina, it was past 11 at night, and we were still an hour and a half from Johnson City, and Rachel was fading fast. She said we should stop. I said we were close. We could push through. She gave me a look that wives give when they've made a decision and are informing you of it rather than consulting you, and she said, "We're stopping. Find somewhere." I started watching the exits. We were in the mountains now, the part of I-26 where the interstate climbs through the Blue Ridge north of Asheville, winding between ridges and long sweeping curves. The exits were sparse. Gas stations, a few chain hotels clustered at the bigger interchanges, and then stretches of nothing where the exits led to two-lane roads that disappeared into dark hollows with no services visible. I was looking for a hotel sign, anything with a lit vacancy notice, when the gravel road appeared in the headlights. It branched off from the road we'd exited onto. I'd taken a random exit, 47 I think, hoping to find a gas station with a parking lot where we could sleep in the car if nothing else. The exit road was dark, no streetlights, no buildings, just pavement running along the base of a ridge. The gravel road was on the left, climbing gently into the trees, and at its entrance was a wooden arch with a sign that read Pine Hollow in carved letters. Below the name, a smaller sign said Campground, with an arrow pointing up the road. Rachel said campground and I said I see it, and I turned in because it was there and we were desperate, and sometimes that's all the reason you need. The gravel road climbed for maybe a quarter mile through dense hardwood forest before leveling out into a clearing. The headlights swept across a small campground, a loop road with about a dozen sites arranged around its perimeter, each with a picnic table and a fire ring and a flat gravel pad for parking. There was a self-pay station near the entrance, a wooden post with a box of envelopes and a metal drop slot, and a sign that listed the nightly rate at $12. The whole place was neat and maintained, the fire rings clean, the tables level, the gravel recently graded. It looked like a small Forest Service campground, the kind scattered throughout the national forest, modestly equipped but well kept. 3 of the sites were occupied. I noticed this as I drove slowly around the loop looking for a spot, and at first it registered as a comfort: other campers, other people, the reassurance of human presence in an unfamiliar place. Site 3 had a blue dome tent set up on the pad with a sedan parked beside it, and 2 camp chairs arranged around a fire ring that held the remains of a fire, gray ash, and a few charred ends of split wood. Site 7 had a larger tent, green, with a cooler beside the picnic table, and a lantern sitting on the table's surface, turned off. Site 9 had a small pop-up tent with a hatchback parked next to it, its rear door open, and on the picnic table a paperback novel lay face down, splayed open to hold someone's place. It wasn't until I'd parked at Site 11 and killed the engine that I realized I hadn't seen a single person. Not at any of the 3 occupied sites, not walking the loop road, not standing in the trees or sitting in the shadows. The tents were set up, the camps were established, the personal belongings were arranged with the casual disorder of people in the middle of a stay, but there was nobody. I sat in the car with the engine off and the headlights dark, and looked at the campground in the thin ambient light and felt the first prickle of something I didn't want to name. Rachel hadn't noticed. She was already reclined in her seat with her eyes closed, halfway to sleep, and I didn't want to alarm her over what was probably nothing. People were in their tents. It was after midnight. Of course they were in their tents. I looked at the blue dome tent at Site 3 and saw the door was zipped shut and told myself there were people inside, sleeping, and that I was being ridiculous. I looked at Site 7 and the green tent was also zipped, and the cooler was closed, and everything was orderly and still. Site 9, the tent was zipped, the hatchback's rear door was open, but the cargo area was empty, and the paperback sat on the table in the dark, as if someone had just set it down to go get a drink or use the bathroom. I told myself I was tired. That was true. I told myself that the highway exhaustion and the dark and the unfamiliar place were combining to make ordinary stillness feel sinister. That was reasonable. I leaned my seat back and closed my eyes and tried to sleep and couldn't, because the silence was wrong. Not quiet silence. No insects. It was late October, so maybe the cold had suppressed them, but even in October in the North Carolina mountains you hear something at night. Crickets winding down, a distant owl, the rustle of small animals in the leaf litter. I heard nothing. The air was dead, the forest was dead, the campground sat in a pocket of perfect soundlessness that pressed against my ears like cotton. I lay there with my eyes closed and listened to the nothing, and the nothing listened back. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for Rachel's breathing to deepen into sleep, long enough for the windshield to fog with our exhalations, long enough for my eyes to adjust, so that when I opened them, the campground was visible in shades of gray and black, the shapes of trees and tents and tables emerging from the dark-like objects in developing film. I was lying on my side, facing the passenger window, which looked out towards Site 9 and the pop-up tent with the hatchback and the novel on the table. I opened my eyes and looked at the tent and felt my heart do something it had never done before, a kind of stumble. A misstep in a rhythm that had been steady for 36 years. I was looking at the tent because I'd heard a sound, the first sound since we'd arrived, the first break in that absolute silence, and it was specific and unmistakable. The sound of a zipper. Not fast, not the brisk zip of someone opening a tent to step out. Slow, deliberate. Tooth by tooth, the zipper on the tent door at Site 9 was being drawn upward from the inside. A low mechanical purr that carried across the silent campground with a clarity that seemed almost aggressive, as if the sound wanted to be heard. I watched. The tent was maybe 30 yards from my car, and in the near darkness I could see the door flap beginning to separate as the zipper climbed, a dark line appearing in the fabric, widening inch by inch. The zipper reached the top and stopped. The flap sagged open under its own weight, peeling back to reveal the interior of the tent, which was dark, darker than the darkness around it, as if the space inside the tent contained a more concentrated version of the night. Nothing came out. No hand pushed the flap aside. No figure emerged. No sound followed the zipper, no rustling of a sleeping bag, no footstep, no breath. The tent simply opened, slowly and completely, from the inside, operated by something I couldn't see, and then sat there with its door gaping at the campground like a mouth. I started the car. Rachel woke with a jolt and said, "What?" And I said, "We're leaving." And I said it in a voice that apparently carried enough urgency that she didn't argue. I pulled out of the site with the headlights off because some instinct told me not to illuminate what was in that tent, what was in any of those tents, and I drove the loop road by the glow of the dashboard and the faint light from a sky I couldn't see. As I passed Site 7, the green tent was open too, its door flap hanging wide, its interior dark and empty, and somehow expectant. Site 3, the blue dome tent, was still zipped. As I passed it, I heard the zipper start. That same slow, tooth-by-tooth sound, beginning at the bottom of the door, climbing. I didn't wait to see it finish. I hit the gravel road and drove down the hill, and turned onto the paved road and accelerated toward the interstate on-ramp, with the speedometer climbing past anything reasonable for a mountain road at night. Rachel asked me what happened, and I told her, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said we should report it, that maybe someone was hurt, that maybe those empty campsites meant something bad had happened. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line the next morning from her parents' house. They took the information politely and called me back 2 hours later. There was no campground off exit 47. There was no Pine Hollow anywhere in their jurisdiction. The deputy had driven the exit road himself and found no gravel turnoff, no wooden arch, no campground. He was professional about it, didn't call me crazy, just said there was nothing there. I went back. 2 days later, on our way home, I took exit 47 and drove the road myself. No gravel turnoff, no arch, no sign that any road had ever branched from that pavement into the trees. Just forest, unbroken, the understory thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel, no gap, no clearing, no indication of any human improvement at any point along the road. I drove it 3 times, slowly, looking, and found nothing. It was Rachel who found the forum post, months later, while searching for something else entirely. A camping forum, a thread about strange experiences in the southern Appalachians. A man in 2015 describing a campground he'd stumbled onto off I-26 the North Carolina mountains. A gravel road, a wooden arch, Pine Hollow, a dozen sites, 3 of them occupied, tents set up, cars parked, personal belongings arranged as if the owners had stepped away moments earlier. No people. He'd stayed an hour and left because something felt wrong. He'd gone back the next day and found nothing. No campground, no road, no arch. He wrote about it the way I would have written about it, carefully, with qualifications. The prose of a rational person trying to describe an irrational experience without sounding unhinged. I messaged him. He responded. We compared details. The wooden arch was the same, the self-pay station was the same, the arrangement of sites was the same. Even the specific details of the occupied camps matched: a blue dome tent, a cooler on a picnic table, a paperback face down as if someone had just set it aside. He'd been there in 2015. I'd been there in 2021. 6 years apart, same place, same details, same absence. The camps hadn't changed. In 6 years, the tents hadn't weathered, the food in the cooler hadn't spoiled, the novel hadn't been picked up or put down. It was the same moment, preserved and repeating, a campground frozen in an instant that nobody was present for, waiting in the mountains for the next traveler to wander up its gravel road and find it. I asked him about the zippers. He said he didn't stay long enough to hear them. I'm glad for him. I hear them still, some nights, when the house is quiet and Rachel is asleep and the silence gets too complete. That slow, deliberate, tooth-by-tooth sound, something inside an empty tent reaching for the door, opening it for a visitor who was never meant to leave. My mother would have picked him up too. I want you to know that, because some people hear this story and the first thing they say is, why would you stop for a stranger on the side of the road in the middle of the night? And the answer is because I was raised by a woman who believed that you help people. That's not a philosophy in Unicoi County. It's a reflex. You see someone broken down, you stop. You see someone walking in the rain, you pull over. You see an old man standing on the shoulder of Route 23 outside Irwin with no umbrella and no coat and the rain coming down so hard the pavement looks like a river. You slow down and you roll down the window and you ask if he needs a ride. That's what my mother would have done, and that's what I did on the night of March 7th, 2018. And I'd do it again, even knowing what I know now, because the alternative is becoming the kind of person who drives past, and that's not something I'm willing to be. It was raining like something biblical. Not the steady mountain rain that you get used to in this part of Tennessee, but a downpour, a deluge, the kind of rain that overwhelms your wipers on the highest setting and turns your headlights into smeared cones of light that don't reach more than 30 feet ahead. I was driving south on 23, coming back from a day trip to Johnson City, where I'd been picking up supplies for the shop. I manage an auto parts store in Irwin, and the back seat and front passenger seat of my car were loaded with boxes of inventory. Brake pads, filters, belts, the mundane necessities of keeping cars running in a county where the roads eat them alive. I'd stayed in Johnson City later than I'd planned, had dinner with a friend, and by the time I was heading home it was close to 11, and the rain had set in with the conviction of a storm that intended to last the night. I saw him about 3 miles south of the Irwin town limits, standing on the right shoulder where the road passes through a stretch of bottomland between the river and the railroad tracks. He was just standing there, not walking, not waving, just facing the road with his arms at his sides in the rain. My headlights caught him, and I registered the details in a quick sequence. Old, thin, gray hair plastered flat against his head, wearing dark pants and a white shirt that was soaked transparent against his narrow chest. No jacket, no bag, no hat. Just an old man standing in the rain on the shoulder of a highway at 11 o'clock at night, as if he'd been placed there, as if he'd always been there, as if standing in downpours on empty roads was simply what he did. I pulled over about 20 yards past him and put the car in park and leaned across to check the passenger side. The front seat was full of boxes. I rolled down the rear window and called back to him, said, "Hey, you need a ride somewhere?" He walked to the car without hurrying, without any change in his posture or pace, and opened the rear door and got in behind me. The rain came in with him, the sound of it suddenly louder with the door open, and I felt the cold and the wet on my neck before he pulled the door shut and the car was sealed again, quiet, except for the wipers and the rain on the roof. I asked him where he was headed. He said an address, a road I knew, about 30 miles south, past Flag Pond, and into the country that stretched toward the North Carolina line. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who was used to being patient about things. It had a quality to it that I noticed but didn't dwell on, a kind of distance, as if it were coming from slightly further away than the back seat. I said I could take him there, no problem, and I pulled back onto the highway. We drove in silence. I tried conversation a couple of times, asked if he lived out that way, mentioned the weather, said something about the road conditions, and he responded with brief, polite answers that didn't invite follow-up. "Yes, sir. It surely is. I appreciate the ride." Old-fashioned courtesy, the kind you hear from men of a certain generation in this part of the country, men who were taught that politeness was the minimum standard of human interaction, and that silence between strangers was a form of respect, not awkwardness. I settled into the drive and let the silence fill the car and concentrated on the road, which was demanding enough in the rain to require my full attention. The wipers beat their steady rhythm, the headlights fought the downpour, the miles passed. I don't know what made me look in the mirror. There was no sound, no movement, no prompt. Maybe 20 minutes into the drive I just glanced up the way you do, the automatic check that drivers make without thinking, and the back seat was empty. I stared at the mirror for long enough that the car drifted toward the center line, and I had to correct. And then I looked over my shoulder, because mirrors can lie, because angles can deceive, because there had to be an explanation. The back seat was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that felt emphatic, as if it were insisting on its own vacancy. The boxes on the passenger side were undisturbed. The rear doors were closed and locked. Both of them, the child locks, engaged the way I always kept them. The seat itself was dry, completely dry. No water stains, no damp patches, no impression in the fabric where a wet man had been sitting for 20 minutes. There was no evidence that anyone had ever been in that seat, except a smell, faint, chemical, sweet in a way that wasn't pleasant, hanging in the air like a residue. I knew that smell, not from experience but from association, from the cultural vocabulary of growing up in a small town where funerals were frequent and the funeral home was on Main Street, and sometimes, when you walked past on a summer day with the windows open, a smell drifted out that you learned later was embalming fluid. That's what it smelled like. Old formaldehyde, preservation. I pulled over. I sat on the shoulder with the rain hammering the roof and my hands on the wheel and my heart beating in a way that felt unsustainable. Too fast, too hard, the rhythm of a body that has encountered something it cannot process. I checked the back seat again. I checked the floor, the footwells, as if a grown man could have slid off the seat and folded himself into the space behind my legs without me noticing. There was nothing. I got out of the car in the rain and opened both rear doors and looked, and there was nothing. No one had gotten out. No one was hiding. The doors had been locked. The man was gone. I should have driven home. I should have turned the car around and gone back to Irwin and crawled into bed and decided in the morning whether I'd dreamed the whole thing. Instead, I drove to the address he'd given me. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only concrete thing I had, the only verifiable detail in an experience that was quickly starting to feel like something my mind had manufactured. I needed to confirm that the address existed, that it corresponded to a real place in the real world, that at least one element of the last half hour was anchored to something solid. The address was a small white house at the end of a gravel drive off a county road south of Flag Pond. It sat in a clearing with a few old hardwoods around it, and a porch across the front and a light on beside the door. It was well kept, modest, the kind of house that generations live in without changing much, because it works, and there's no reason to fix what works. I parked in the drive and sat for a moment, and then got out and walked to the porch and knocked on the door, and I had no idea what I was going to say. A woman answered. 60s, maybe late 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back, and a face that was lined in the way faces get lined by weather and work, and a life lived mostly outdoors. She looked at me standing on her porch in the rain at nearly midnight, and she didn't seem surprised or alarmed. She seemed like she was waiting. I said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you this late." I said I'd picked up a man on the road outside Irwin, and he'd given me this address, and then I stopped. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. She watched me struggle with it, and her expression didn't change, and she said, "Describe him." I described him. The thin frame, the gray hair, the white shirt, the quiet manner. She listened, and then she said, "Wait here," and she went inside. She came back with a photograph in a frame, the kind of frame you buy at a drugstore, simple wood, holding a picture that had the slightly faded quality of film from the early 90s. It was a man standing in front of this house, on this porch, in what looked like autumn light, thin, gray-haired, wearing dark pants and a white shirt. The same man, the same face I'd seen in my headlights on the shoulder of Route 23 less than an hour ago. She held the photograph up, and I looked at it, and the ground shifted under me in a way that wasn't physical, but felt physical, a fundamental rearrangement of what I understood to be possible. She said that was her father. She said his name, I won't share it here, because it belongs to her and to him and not to this story. She said he died in 1994, 24 years earlier. She said he died at a hospital in Johnson City, and that the route I'd been driving, 23 south from Irwin, was the route he'd driven home from work every night for 30 years. She said I was the fourth person to bring him home. 4 people over 24 years. 4 strangers who'd stopped in the rain and picked up an old man on the side of the road and driven him south and lost him somewhere between Irwin and Flag Pond, and arrived at her door confused and shaken with a story that didn't believe themselves. She thanked me. She thanked me like I'd done something kind, something she appreciated, and then she closed the door and the porch light went off. And I stood there in the dark in the rain and listened to the water dripping off the eaves and tried to feel the ground beneath my feet and trust that it was solid. I drove home. I checked the mirror every 30 seconds for an hour, and the back seat was empty, and the smell had faded, and the rain didn't stop until morning. I've never picked up a hitchhiker since, not because I'm afraid, or not only because I'm afraid, but because I don't know what it means to give a ride to a dead man, and I don't know what it would mean to do it twice. And sometimes, driving 23 at night in the rain, I slow down near that stretch of bottomland and look at the shoulder and it's empty, and I'm relieved. And I'm something else too, something I can't name, something close to sorrow, because an old man has been trying to get home for 30 years, and the only way he can do it is one stranger at a time, 30 miles at a ride, disappearing before he arrives, starting over in the rain, waiting on the shoulder for the next person kind enough to stop. Route 58 inches Southwest Virginia is one of those roads that people who've never driven it don't understand. On a map, it looks straightforward, a state highway running east to west across the bottom of the state, connecting the coast to the Cumberland Gap through some of the most remote terrain in Virginia. But a map doesn't show you how the road feels at night, how it narrows in the mountain sections to a strip of pavement barely wide enough for two cars, how it dips into hollows so deep the headlights seem to fall into them like water, how the ridges press in from both sides until the sky shrinks to a sliver and the forest becomes a wall, and the only thing you're certain of is the 20 feet of asphalt lit up in front of you. I grew up in Abingdon, about 15 miles north of Damascus, and I've driven 58 my whole life. I know it the way you know the face of someone you love, every line, every mark, every feature so familiar it barely registers anymore. That's why what happened to me in October of 2020 was so disorienting. Not because the road did something I didn't expect, but because it stopped being the road I knew. It stopped being a road at all, in any sense that I understand the word, and became something else. Something closed, something circular, something that didn't want to let me out. I was driving home from a weekend in Breaks, Virginia, where a buddy of mine had a cabin. Good weekend. Nothing remarkable. Some fishing, some bourbon, the kind of quiet time in the mountains that I needed after a long stretch of work. I left his place around 8 in the evening, figuring I'd be home by 10. The sun was already down and the mountain dark had settled in completely by the time I hit 58, heading west toward Damascus. The road was empty. October on a Sunday night, nobody going anywhere, just me and the headlights and the familiar curves. I'd been driving for about 40 minutes when I passed a dead tree. It was on the right side of the road, a big oak that had been killed by lightning or disease, its trunk bent at an angle that made it look like it was bowing, its bare branches reaching over the road like fingers. I noticed it the way you notice things on a night drive passively, without interest, just another landmark in the stream of landmarks that the headlights delivered and the darkness swallowed. A minute later, I passed a section of guardrail that was rusted orange, a short stretch maybe 20 feet long where the rail had corroded to the color of dried blood. Then mile marker 37, a green reflective sign on a metal post, the number clear in the headlights. 10 minutes passed. I came around a curve and my headlights found a dead tree on the right side of the road. A big oak, bent trunk, bare branches reaching over the pavement. The same tree. I knew it was the same tree with an immediacy that bypassed rational thought. A recognition that happened in my body before my mind could construct an alternative explanation. I gripped the wheel and watched the road deliver the rusted guardrail. Then mile marker 37. The same sequence, the same landmarks, the same stretch of road I'd driven 10 minutes earlier, presented to me again as if I'd never left it. I checked the GPS on my phone. It showed me on 58, heading west, making normal progress. The blue dot was moving steadily along the route, past Damascus, toward Abingdon. According to the phone, I was almost home. According to the road, I was nowhere, locked in a stretch of mountain highway that kept handing me the same dead tree and the same rusted guardrail and the same mile marker in an endless loop that my instruments couldn't detect. I drove the loop 3 more times, each time watching for the landmarks, each time hoping they wouldn't appear, each time feeling my stomach drop when they did. Dead tree, guardrail, mile marker 37. Dead tree, guardrail, mile marker 37. The road between repetitions felt normal curves, grades, the usual mountain terrain, but it always brought me back. I tried turning onto a side road that branched off to the left between the guardrail and the mile marker, a narrow paved track that climbed into the ridge. I followed it for maybe half a mile before it curved and descended and deposited me back on 58, facing west, with the dead tree ahead of me in the headlights. I tried a pull-off on the right that looked like it connected to a gravel road. It went 50 yards into the trees and ended at a turnaround that faced me back toward the highway. Every exit led back to the loop. Every deviation was corrected. The road was a closed system, and I was inside it. On the fifth or sixth pass, I stopped the car. I put it in park in the middle of the road with the engine running and the headlights on, and I got out and stood on the pavement and listened. The silence was total. Not quiet silence, the aggressive absence of sound, as if the mountains had drawn a breath and held it. No insects, no wind, no distant engine or barking dog or any of the small background sounds that populate even the emptiest night in the Appalachians. Just nothing. A silence so complete that I could hear my own blood moving, and the tick of the cooling engine, and the faint electronic hum of the headlights, and nothing else. The mountains stood around me like walls, and the sky above was black and starless, and the road stretched in both directions into darkness that my headlights couldn't penetrate, and I felt, for the first time in my life, that I was in a place that was not part of the world I lived in, that I'd slipped sideways into some fold in the geography, some crease in the road where the normal rules of distance and direction didn't apply, and that the only way out was a way I hadn't found yet. I got back in the car and drove. On the seventh pass, I saw the figure. It was standing near the dead tree, just off the shoulder on the right side, a dark shape that was too tall and too still to be anything I wanted to look at directly. My headlights swept across it as I passed, and I got an impression of height and narrowness, and a posture that suggested watching, and then it was behind me, and I was driving toward the guardrail and the mile marker, and my hands were shaking on the wheel. On the eighth pass, there were two figures. Same spot, near the dead tree, standing a few feet apart, both motionless, both facing the road. On the ninth pass, four. They weren't doing anything. They weren't approaching the road or gesturing or moving in any way. They were just there, standing in the dark near that dead tree, and every time I came around the loop, there were more of them. As if each repetition was a summons, a signal, an announcement of my presence that was drawing them from wherever they spent their time when the road wasn't looping and nobody was trapped on it. I stopped counting passes. I stopped counting figures. I drove with my eyes on the road and my hands locked on the wheel, and I didn't look at the tree line when I passed the dead oak, because the shapes in my peripheral vision had become a crowd and I didn't want to know how many. The loop continued, delivering me through the same landmarks with mechanical precision, and each time I passed that spot, the presence at the edge of the road was larger, denser, a gathering that I could feel even without looking, a weight of attention focused on my car as it circled past like an animal on a track. And then it stopped. Between one moment and the next, without transition, without warning, the loop broke. I was driving west on 58, and the road was different. The curves were wrong, the grade was wrong, the landmarks were unfamiliar, and my GPS said I was 10 miles past Damascus, nearly home. I looked at the clock and 2 hours had passed since I'd entered the loop. I looked at the odometer and I'd driven 153 miles on a stretch of road that should have been 20. 153 miles of the same dead tree and the same guardrail and the same mile marker, over and over, while figures accumulated in the darkness at the roadside and the mountains held their silence and the road refused to let me go until, for reasons I will never understand, it did. I made it home. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long time before I went inside. I haven't driven 58 at night since. During the day it's fine, it's just a road, just asphalt and guardrails and mile markers that pass once and stay past. But I won't drive it after dark. I won't test whatever I fell into that night, whatever fold in the road opened up and swallowed 150 miles of driving without moving me an inch. And when people ask me why, I tell them the road has moods, and I say it like a joke, and they laugh, and I don't, because I know what's standing near that dead tree in the dark, patient and accumulating, waiting for the next set of headlights to come around the bend and join the loop.